people are so used to thinking of Basquiat as being famous all the time and expensive all the time. In the early 1990s, nobody wanted to buy his work. Art has become less culturally relevant in the world. It's oftentimes seems to be dealing with narrow concepts, over intellectualized concepts. Notion of beauty, grandeur, pleasure have often been sidelined. Humans have been creating great art for, thousands and thousands of years. People will continue to create great art. The challenge is to figure out, well, what's good and why. And that's a fun sport.
Welcome to Vita Brevis, a podcast about business, art, life, and death. I'm your host, Carlos Cardenas. Here we explore how business, creativity, and philanthropy intersect through the lives of remarkable people. I talk with entrepreneurs and community leaders who are passionate collectors and visionary patrons to discover how art shapes their work, purpose, and legacy. Because life is short, but art is forever. Welcome back to Vita Brevis. Today we're exploring one of the most fascinating phenomena in modern culture, the transformation of an artist into a global icon. And I can't think of a better voice to join me today than Doug Woodham. If the art world has a secret service for high-stakes strategies, Doug is on the board. He spent years as a partner at McKinsey & Company, where he looked at the global architecture of wealth and asset management. But he's not just a quant. Doug eventually moved from management consulting to the very heart of the art establishment, serving as the president of Christie's for the Americas. During his tenure, he sat at the controls during a period of massive global scaling and record-shattering auctions. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Michigan, and he's the author of the Essential Collector's Guide, Art Collecting Today. He's here today to talk about his latest deep dive, Jean-Michel Basquiat, The Making of an Icon. It's a book that the Basquiat estate tried to quiet by refusing image rights, because Doug doesn't just write about the history or the art. He writes about the machine. He writes about how a kid from Brooklyn was transformed into a multi-billion-dollar global asset class unto himself, and what the Basquiatification of the market means for every collector, artist, and museum in the world today. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Doug Woodham. Your new book, Jean-Michel Basquiat, The Making of an Icon, it feels like a sort of forensic autopsy on how the artist became a global currency. Now, before we dive into the mechanics, tell us, why did you choose to write about Basquiat in particular? Why now? And what does his trajectory tell us about the soul of the current art market?
Well, I've been following Basquiat's career for over 40 years, starting back in 1982 when my wife and I moved to New York City after graduate school. Today, and it's always fascinating. Today, Basquiat is just so firmly planted in the public's consciousness as one of the most famous and expensive artists of the past 100 years. And the story of sort of how and why that really happened, the exceptionalism of it all, I thought would make for a great book because it's really a story of not only art, but of business, of economics, of cultural dynamics. Um, so pre-COVID, I committed myself to writing this book because I've got my day job as an advisor. So this is my nights and weekends project. And I think what I figured I had a comparative advantage in writing it, and it's also when I came to realize it's really the first major book about Basquiat to be written in almost 30 years. And so much has changed since the last major book, which came out in the 1990s. I thought the market would appreciate being able to read a sort of updated, authoritative, and entirely new take on Basquiat.
There's this idea of the cool factor, and he's so ubiquitous now, right? He's
Yes.
everywhere. He's in
Yes.
the press. I mean, major movies. You can get him. You can get an iPhone case with a Basquiat on it, right? So, you know, if anybody can have something, the cool factor dies, right? And, you could get a Basquiat on a Uniqlo t-shirt or a Coach bag or, any of the sort of accoutrements we just mentioned, but the paintings, continue to go up in value. So this seems kind of, a little bit ironic. So how does an artist successfully bridge the gap between like the velvet rope of a high-end auction and the kind of high volume world of retail?
Sure. So that crossover, okay, it's a path only open to a very, very small select group of artists. Um, and the necessary condition to even think about being a crossover, the necessary condition is you have to be a great artist. You have to um, have been distinctive in some shape, way, or form in your art practice. But that's a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition at all. In
Mm,
addition to being a great artist, you really need to have crossed over into the public consciousness as being cool. Um, and the cool factor really comes from you having a interesting personal narrative that really leans into what the public is interested in or drawn to today. And if you take those sort of abstract ideas that I just mentioned, who are artists who've been crossover? Basquiat is one, Frida Kahlo's another, Andy Warhol, and Vincent van Gogh. They're all cool. They're all interesting. Their personal narratives, their personal stories um, resonate with people today, in part like Basquiat and Frida Kahlo because of trauma-related associations. Same
mhm.
thing with Vincent van Gogh. Picasso and Rothko, who were both, terrific artists, they're not cool. There's nothing cool about Rothko. There's nothing cool about Picasso. You're not gonna see Picasso showing up on lots of trinkets. It doesn't mean, of course, that he isn't a great artist, but it's more just if you wanna bridge that gap between sort of, if you wanna be in the twin pantheons of fine art and pop culture, um, you've gotta be a great artist, and there has to be a coolness associated with your brand,
Mhm.
that, promotes and elevates you so that you have opportunities to have your artwork or your image of your face showing up on T-shirts, shoes, and trinkets, that are sold everywhere.
So what makes Basquiat cool? I mean, you know, kids are getting Basquiat tattoos. That's pretty next level stuff.
Yes, yes. So with Basquiat, the coolness factor, comes from a couple of sources. One is he, for reasons we can talk about in detail if you want. He in the 1990s, long after he had died, and just as a reminder to audience members, he was born in 1960, born in Brooklyn, to upwardly mobile, parents. His mom was of Puerto Rican descent, his dad was a Haitian immigrant, um, um and he was ambitious, had a bunch of traumas that he had to stare down, many of which he probably never really overcame. But he died, when he was 27, in 1988. His career as an artist was very short. He was actually an artist for only about 8 years, and he achieved a certain level of notoriety and acclaim during his lifetime, um, but his marketplace in the early '90s fell apart. I mean, but people are so used to thinking of Basquiat as being famous all the time and expensive all the time. In the early 1990s, nobody wanted to buy his work, didn't appear at auction. Um, and it took a bunch of actions and events over the course of the 1990s to actually resuscitate his career. One of the important things that resuscitated his career in the 1990s, the art world started its pivot to, identity being perhaps the most important criteria around which to evaluate whether an artist was interesting and relevant. How did their race, their gender, their sexuality, manifest itself in what they put on, the wall in their paintings, drawings, or sculpture? Um, that ideology, if you will, had sort of formed in the 1980s in the sort of academic art world, and then really its head lifted above the parapet, if you will, in the early 1990s with a couple of exhibitions at the Whitney Museum that really sort of evangelized an artist identity as being a really important factor in
Mhm,
understanding and appreciating artists.
mhm,
Basquiat in the 1990s, became he was anointed as the Black artist associated with this sort of thinking, um, and people who were attuned to that sort of attitudinal change in the art market, started to become much more interested and receptive to owning Basquiat. So,
mhm,
one coolness factor associated with him is he became the sort of bellwether of a new way of thinking about what made for interesting art. And like most markets, if you're the first one to be anointed, or the second one, you get a lot of the benefits of being anointed. If you're the
mhm,
20th or
mhm,
30th, less so. So one of his coolness factors is he's associated as a black male artist who is painting the black male experience, and he was
mhm,
one of the first to do that.
mhm,
I think
mhm,
another coolness factor associated with him is tragedy. I mean, he died when he was 27. He died of a heroin overdose.
mhm,
Um, and just like Van Gogh dying young, we romanticize these artists who die young. So that's a factor behind his coolness.
mhm,
And I
mhm,
think a third and important thing is um, he was associated in his lifetime with Andy Warhol. Um, he was also associated with Madonna.
mhm,
You know, when Madonna was in New York, recording her debut album, and she was still relatively unknown, um, Basquiat and Madonna dated each other. They lived together for a period of time. That's marketing gold. I mean, I don't think either of them had any
mhm,
influence whatsoever on their careers. And it was a relatively short association. But if you think about, the photographs that were taken of the two of them together, it's sexy, it's cool.
mhm,
And I guess I should say that the last thing about Basquiat is Basquiat, was a tall, handsome, well-spoken, man who understood the sort of visual impact of how you wore your hair, the clothes you wore, how you styled
mhm.
yourself. Um, so there are just so many photographs of this cool, young, good-looking,
Yeah,
man. So those are all priceless factors,
yeah.
associated with being cool.
Yeah, yeah. And, we have this romanticized idea of, lifestyles in Manhattan, in the '80s, for example. And someone like him just embodies that. It's a crossover between, the art world and hip hop and punk rock and Studio 54 and we hear stories of him, hanging out with Madonna and going out to Gagosian's place in LA, and you're just like, "Oh my god, this guy is cool."
Yes.
It's kinda easy to sort of see that angle as soon as you kinda scratch the surface a little bit.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
an interesting point also, and this is a little bit off script compared for what we wanted to talk about, but it kinda makes me think. I'm wondering if great art can be taught. I think about some of the examples you gave. I mean, Basquiat wasn't, a product of Cooper Union or Cal Arts or anything like that.
Yes.
There's a strong outsider element to what he was doing.
Yes.
Um, it kind of raises an interesting point. I'm part of me thinks that if you go through the kind of institutional channels, you're probably going to be making institutional art.
Right. Right, right, right. It's only been in the past 20 years, let's say, where people who aspire to be artists have felt like they've got to get an MFA.
Mhm.
Um, um, Basquiat was self-taught. Francis Bacon was self-taught. Most of the great artists, modern artists, were in many cases self-taught. I think what's happened is the business side of being an artist has grown in importance. So I think when somebody goes and gets an MFA at Yale, let's say, um, it's it's less, it's certainly not about them perfecting their technique of drawing, painting, sculpting. It's really about them building a personal network
Mhm.
um, of like-minded souls at that school and their alumni and the events that those schools create for people who are part of their MFA, and for you to figure out your personal brand and figure out how you need to navigate the art market. So
Yeah.
there has been an institutionalization of the art market, particularly from the perspective of young up and coming artists, feeling like they've gotta get that degree. It's a remarkably expensive degree, and the failure rate, if you will, associated with those degrees is pretty high 'cause the art market's not that large, and so if you take on $250,000 worth of debt to get one of those degrees, it's a risky investment. Um, but
Yeah.
I think, an artist who, there does have it's a passion activity, and people wanna see that passion, and they wanna see it on the wall or in the work, and they wanna see it in how you personally talk about it or express it. So
Mhm.
I think the idea of a sort of AI artist being manufactured that's gonna resonate, um, I'm sure people are trying it right now.
Yeah, I hear there's some interesting work being made around the idea of AI. I have yet to see it personally. I think it's
Yeah,
a threat for the graphic arts and
yeah,
anything that's kind of, pixel based, I guess, to keep it simple. But
absolutely.
as far as, ideas based conceptual art, I think for the time being, we're relatively safe on that.
I
Um,
agree.
we'll see what happens.
Yes.
Um, in the book, you mentioned Basquiat's father, Gerard, and how strategic he was, God, with everything, and I'll let you sort of expand on that a little bit. But in particular, he wanted to start licensing the images of the work to start paying for boring stuff like,
Yeah.
insurance and storage. Um, you know, from your, McKinsey Christie's perspective, who's really winning in these brand deals? You know, is it a validation tool for the estate, or is it just a cash cow on the balance sheet there? What's the idea behind
Yeah.
licensing the work?
Well, let me start the answer first by just the Basquiat case, because people I think will find that interesting. So when Basquiat dies in '88, his parents, who were estranged from each other, inherited everything. New York State law made that clear. And so Basquiat made about 1,000 paintings in his life, um, and he had stashed away in storage about 171 of them that his parents, jointly inherited, so about 20% of his paintings output. And he made about 2,000 drawings, 1,000 of which the estate owned. So there was this treasure trove of art that his parents, um, now owned. He spent everything he earned, and so there wasn't much cash in the checking account. There were no investment accounts. He didn't have a car. He didn't have expensive furniture. It was basically he spent everything. So his dad, who was trained as an accountant and who was a savvy businessman, um, early on in his role as being the executor of the estate, decided he wanted to continue to own as much of his son's work as possible. He decided that in part because he saw some other strategic buyers, if you will, taking an interest in his son's work. And so he wanted to continue to own as much as possible. So at some point, he pivoted to, I gotta generate some cash. Um, he sold infrequently, when the estate needed cash, but he was, again, wanted to hold on to the assets. And licensing became a vehicle for doing that. And it started to generate the cash that he coveted for purposes of paying insurance costs, storage costs, etc. Um, yeah, with the Basquiat estate, I mean, the dad and the team he used were masterful. I mean, they,
Mm.
the real breakout came when they did a deal with Adidas, where Basquiat, artwork, became, used on Adidas, sneakers. Um, and so it really produced the revenue he was looking for. I mean, now it's not public, but using some comparable data, the estate's probably making over $10 million a year on licensing
Oh,
fees.
nice. And now that's the
So
2 sisters, right?
yeah, yeah. So that's nice, sweet revenue. So I think the to back to your point, the look when artists sort of top of class, again, the ones who are great artists who sort of crossed over into the public consciousness, they have the ability to license and for those licensing revenues to be quite substantial. It doesn't necessarily negatively impact their market because 'cause they're already established. Um, and so I think the licensing for established folks, doesn't hurt. I think it helps because it validates for lots of people that the artist is interesting and relevant. I mean, take Jeff Koons, for example.
Mm,
Um, Jeff Koons, is still an extraordinarily expensive artist. I mean, he used to be more expensive. His prices have fallen in the past 5, 10 years. But he's still
mhm,
extraordinarily expensive. And, Jeff Koons, he has lots of licensing revenue that he's generating from balloon dog sculptures and things like that. The way to think about it is every artist has a client pyramid. At the
mhm,
top are the people who have the means and desire to own a piece of work by you and are willing to pay up. You've got lots of people who are aware of you as an artist and like your work and maybe follow you, but they can't afford to own anything by you. So at the bottom of that client pyramid
mhm,
can be, thousands, hundreds of thousands of interested parties. So, licensing becomes a way to monetize the bottom of your client pyramid, um, either in terms of T-shirts or you create limited edition sculptures or limited edition prints. Um, I think you can't, as a young artist, sort of quickly move to thinking, "Oh, I can license my stuff." You've gotta build out your client pyramid first,
mhm,
you know,
mhm,
and it has to have a tall peak, if you will, of people who are interested in the high end because monetizing the bottom of your client pyramid, um, totally valid. If you've got that pyramid and you do it in a tasteful way, I don't think it hurts your brand. I think it helps validate you being interesting and important.
mm,
And it's fascinating over the past 3 to 5 years, you're starting to see more and more successful living contemporary artists branch into that sort of monetization
mhm, mhm,
bottom of their client pyramid. Rashid Johnson's doing that.
mhm.
Maurizio Catalan is doing it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, there's also sort of a middle ground where, you're starting to see collabs, It might be a limited edition, you know, piece of furniture or something like this, or, I've seen, like, skateboard decks, things like this, or
Yes.
you mentioned Adidas earlier. And like you mentioned, we're seeing a lot more of that. Murakami's been doing that for God, I guess at least 15, if not more, 20 years.
Yeah.
Started doing stuff with Vuitton, and that led. God, who else got into that? There
Well,
was
Kusama's just
Kusama. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Kusama for sure.
interesting artist, but probably best known as just been a phenomenal commercial animal.
Yeah, 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 a phenomenal artist as well, absolutely. But it's interesting to see, we're seeing more and more of this, and we are starting to see it with some sort of younger, artists. There's an artist named, Daniel Arsham, I believe, and he's, collaborating with Porsche, for example. I mean,
Yes.
it's interesting to see. Um, it's interesting to see these artist careers are being run as essentially luxury brands,
Yes.
and, selling paintings is maybe the tip of the iceberg, like you mentioned, it's the top of the pyramid, but it's only one part of the equation. Um, did Gerard Basquiat, did he kind of originate this kind of business model?
Thank you for listening to Vita Brevis. If you know someone who would enjoy this conversation, please share it with them. A follow or review also goes a long way in helping us grow. Thank you. And remember, life is short, but art is forever.
Did Gerard Basquiat, did he kind of originate this kind of business model?
The one who plowed the field first, I think, was Keith Haring. Um,
Okay.
So Keith Haring, in the 1980s, went to the same clubs as Basquiat, hung out with Warhol. I mean, Basquiat and Haring were friends. Um, Haring was really the first contemporary artist who, in the in kind of in the mid 80s, his work started to become expensive and lots of people at the bottom of his client pyramid, to use that framework, couldn't afford his work. He actually opened up a store in Soho called the Pop Shop, um, where you could go and buy keychains, T-shirts, and other really low-priced works that were emblazoned with some of his iconic images. And at the time, people thought, horrible idea. It's gonna ruin your high-end, market. He was like, "Nah." He opened this store, phenomenally successful, in terms of turnover, so much so that he opened a second one in Tokyo, and it had no deleterious effect that I've ever been able to detect on his high-end prices.
Well, what's
Uh,
fascinating, it almost seems like closing the circle from an initial concept from pop art, right? Where quotidian, everyday objects were sort of being looked through the lens of fine art. And, whenever that was, I guess, 20, 30 years later, people are like, let's just cut out the middleman and you know, let's make art into a keychain.
yeah, yeah,
Or,
yeah. Yeah, I think it's a good idea. Again, not everybody can do it, but Herring was the one who did it first, and Herring died of AIDS, I wanna say in, it's the late '80s, and he knew he was gonna die. He did some estate planning. He actually told the executor of his estate, and he set up a foundation was set up right after he died, that, and that estate inherited his artwork, inherited some cash, inherited all the copyrights. But he also told them that, hold on to as much of the art as possible, so it's available to lend to museums for shows in the future. Use licensing revenue to generate, the revenue that he wanted his foundation to be able to distribute to AIDS education and children's charities. So there was a philanthropic side of Keith Haring that is, I think, just very admirable about continuing to license as a way to fund charitable events. The team that advised Herring in his lifetime on these matters and also advised the estate posthumously were the same advisors that Gerard Basquiat used. Um, so Gerard sort of learned from them the Keith Haring playbook. Um, it
mhm.
took Gerard a little bit of time to embrace that playbook, but it was Haring who, from an artist perspective, who was the innovator, and then it was a group of lawyers, and others who created the legal framework, um, that led Gerard to go, "This is a great way to generate revenue."
So going back to a theme we talked about earlier, talking about the sort of shift to identity-based narratives that started in the 90s. And of course, we established Basquiat as sort of being anointed, maybe the representative of this. And today we see something of a correction as far as this lack of representation of people of color in the art market. You mentioned Rashid Johnson. We talked about Henry Taylor. Kerry James Marshall. The list is long now, and it's a pretty deep bench. It's really interesting. So clearly, Basquiat was the first to kind of smash the ceiling. Is he still the sort of like the sort of barometer to which a lot of identity-based work is sort of referred to? I mean, is he still the icon?
I th well, I think he's still viewed as, rightly or wrongly, as the first, um Black contemporary artist of note. That statement is incorrect, because there were lots of Black and Hispanic artists active in the 70s and 80s who were doing great work. They just didn't have the right gallery representation. They didn't figure out how to navigate the art market that well. They weren't received that well. Many of those artists who were active and doing great work then have since achieved the acclaim that they were seeking. It took 30 years for it to happen, but they're in museum collections, they're in shows, they're in galleries. But Basquiat was anointed as the first, and again, he benefited from that. Somebody has to break barriers. Basquiat was the one. I think what was useful about his art, um, is a lot of identity-based art created in the 1980s and to some extent in the 1990s, um, was dour, installation-based, obscure. You needed to read the wall label to figure out what this stuff was about.
Mm,
I mean, it was interesting, but it was intellectually interesting. Its visual power was generally not that strong. Um, Basquiat's work, you can stand in front of a great early Basquiat painting. It's like, oh my God, like this 6 by 6 foot, assaulting image that's like unbelievable.
mhm,
You don't need to read a wall label to react to it.
mhm.
So I think Basquiat, in a funny sort of way, he sort of broke through, but he was a very traditional artist in the sense it was paint on canvas. It was he was not doing a video. He wasn't doing an installation piece, so he was the antithesis of an institutional artist. You could buy the work and you could hang it on the wall. Um,
Mm.
but I think, again, he was anointed as the sort of significant Black artist in the 1990s. That was just the beginning of the embrace by the art world of identity. I mean, it since has just become the predominant ethos around which so many critics, curators, um, think about what makes an artist interesting and relevant. It's probably been overplayed, because there are now all these sort of fine gradations, and the marketing literature for some artists at times, it's just you just wow, it's like it's they're trying to push, and I mean, I'm not it's like there's a Pakistani transgender artist exploring issues of the Pakistani diaspora and colonialism, and what it means for life today. I mean, that there's nothing wrong with being an artist wanting to pursue that intellectual approach to the art. It just though is so narrow in a funny sort of way that it's not necessarily a broad theme. It's something that's relevant to them. So
Well,
it's fascinating to me how there are all these little fine little silos that artists are dropping themselves into, in part because that's what they wanna express. It's also in part how they think they need to distinguish themselves in the marketplace.
yeah, well, it's definitely interesting that, this kind of identity-based strategies, that's practically, the defining characteristic of, I wanna say art of this century so far. The same way that there were periods we talked about, I don't know, pop art or minimalism or conceptual art, et cetera. it's big and it can't be ignored. And, and it's, not a perfect kind of, situation, but it's a force to be dealt with. So
Right.
it's just the reality of the current situation, and, different artists will sort of navigate this, in different ways. One thing I wanted to talk about is, in the current market, there's kind of there's been a softening in the last few years that we talked about. And one of the themes that we hear about this is that the next generation of, the sort of collector class is more interested in experiences and in vibes than they are in objects. They'd rather go to the Super Bowl or, skiing in Japan or something like this than say, buy an object, regardless of the value. And it seems that experiences are more valued than, fine art objects. This is a narrative that we're hearing. But I'm wondering if the sort of bottom of the pyramid you described earlier, is this a way for people to engage in an artist's vibe, where, hey, I don't have to buy a Basquiat painting or, a really expensive artwork. I'll get, a limited edition shirt and wear that on my ski trip in Japan. You know? There's this idea that the object is being replaced either through experiences or, you know, consumable objects.
Yeah. So I think there are elements of what you're suggesting. Look, I think the art market, its footing is off. Um, and its footing is off for a variety of reasons. One is, I think art has become less culturally relevant in the world, um, because it's oftentimes seems to be dealing with narrow concepts, over intellectualized concepts. Notion of beauty, grandeur, pleasure, um, have often been sidelined. And so I think for a lot of people who might be potential collectors who've got the means, and maybe the desire to engage with culture at a meaningful level. Because let's remember, the art we're talking about is very expensive. I mean, spending 50 or $100,000 on a painting, not that many people have the wealth to do that. And so, and artists who want to be able to pay their mortgage and send their kids to school, they got to be selling paintings for 50 or $100,000 to be able to generate that. So the number of collectors who, sort of want to engage in that, it's really not a growing market, because art, I think, is just feels more sort of hermetically sealed in its own world, and isn't necessarily dealing with sort of broad themes that interest people. And I think another thing that's happening is to your point, experiences. I mean, people have so many choices about where to spend their money. And so if you are a wealthy person deciding, gee, do I want to spend my time and effort learning the art market, engaging with it and buying art, there's a certain social cachet you'll get with that. But, maybe instead you wanna spend $250,000 taking your friends on a cruise, along the Amalfi Coast, because that's gonna create a set of bonds and experiences that are more interesting and personal and meaningful. So I think as art becomes more idiosyncratic, as it becomes more narrow, as it maybe deals with narrower issues, it's sort of shrinking its relevance in the cultural landscape. And you're seeing that in, museum attendance isn't growing anymore. If you look at turnover in the art market over the past 10, 15 years and you adjust it for inflation, the turnover in the art market has shrunk pretty dramatically.
Yeah, very strange times. We'll probably have to dive really deep into all of this on another episode.
Absolutely. I wanted to sort of tantalize.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
There
I
were
think it's
re
working.
a variety of provocative statements there. But to tie it back to, sort of Basquiat and the high end, um, look, Basquiat is in the twin pantheons of fine art and pop culture,
Yeah,
and,
yeah, yeah.
um, so many artists wanna be there. I mean, that he's in many cases become, "I gotta get me some of that," both as a collector, but as an artist, it's like, how can I what was the Basquiat playbook and how can I apply it?
Yeah, yeah. So continuing back on some of the previous Basquiat related issues we've been discussing, I know that the estate did not give you the rights for any of the imagery and did not, support your book in any sense. And I think it's because you're very open about you addressing unauthorized topics, his drug addiction, his bisexuality, etc. And in your view, is an estate's job to sort of, protect, the truth or their truth of the artist's life? Or is the estate just essentially, an asset manager protecting, the stock price of the brand?
Yeah. I look, I think well-managed estates do both of those things. Well-managed estates, um, are focused on what's the narrative, and who do we wanna work with to evangelize and solidify that narrative in the art world? So I think that's a really, really important job, and I think some estates wanna put forward very sanitized views of the artist's narrative, others don't, so there are different flavors of that, but I think, um picking that narrative and evangelizing it is very important, and I think being open to that modifying and changing over time. I think second is helping preserve asset value, either the assets that you own, um, um, or how the marketplace, validates and verifies, works being authentic. I mean, the best example of that is the Calder estate. The Alexander Calder estate, um, does a masterful job of, inspecting and analyzing and, in a sense, certifying that a work by Alexander Calder is authentic. Um, and the marketplace has sort of adopted their standards. And so it means that there's integrity to the Calder market. If somebody buys a Calder at auction, the Calder estate requires you, if you're going to sell something, to share it with the estate, and they look at it, they inspect it, they analyze it, um, they check to see if the records associated with that work are accurate and correct, and will, if they feel like it's an authentic work, they won't issue a certificate of authenticity, but they will enter it into their archives with an official number. Auction houses, the reputable ones, will not sell an Alexander Calder that hasn't passed through that process. Um, Look, most of these estates, they want to avoid being that have their ass sued by a disgruntled somebody, who bought something that they found out after the fact was a fake, and they're mad at that foundation of that estate for saying it. I mean, U.S. law is such that anybody can sue anybody, and most estates don't want to take on that burden. But I think as states, I think good estates, they do play a role in, sort of solidifying the fact base around what are the authentic works, maybe solidifying the fact based around the artist's process, um, their exhibition history, so that people can buy with confidence. So I think artist estates ideally are involved in those two roles of evangelizing narratives, but also sort of documenting the artist's true career and body of work. There there are many artists that say, look, some artists, when they die, it's like some child or uncle starts running the estate and they totally screw it up. They sell everything because they want to raise cash because I mean, there's so many estate messes out there, and then there's some that are run really, really well. Um,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
The Basquiat estate, Basquiat's dad, um, who started being responsible for the estate when his son died in 1988. Gerard was a sophisticated, savvy guy in the 1990s. Well, he really hated the fact that his son was bisexual. He hated the fact that his son experienced some profound traumas early in his life when he was 7 that I write about extensively in the book. Um, um, you know, Gerard had an estranged relationship with his son for many years, but they loved each other deeply and they were involved. But look, he didn't like his bisexuality. He didn't like these traumas. He really hated the fact that his son was a drug addict. Um, and so his father really restricted anybody talking about that, and the way he restricted it was very clever. If you were a museum or a gallery and you wanted to do a show about Basquiat and you wanted to do a catalog, um, you had to get the estate's permission to use those images in your catalog. Um, um, you just couldn't freely take a photograph of an artwork and pop it into an exhibition catalog. You had to come and, in a sense, kiss Gerard's ring to get permission. And
Mhm.
he early on would say to somebody, "Oh, I'm perhaps happy to support you in the show, but you've got to send me your essays well in
Wow.
advance of publication because I need to fact check them." And seemingly benign request. But what would happen is if you mention anything about topics that he didn't like, he would yell at you, tell, "How do you know this?" And he would withhold support. And so that's why virtually everything that's been written in museum catalogs or in gallery, Basquiat's childhood, it's all rainbows and unicorns.
Mhm.
Um, it's you would think he was alpha male only having sex with women. I mean, it's a more complicated story.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so look, I would have loved to have had a few Basquiat images in the book, but I was not willing to have I wasn't willing to edit the narrative to be
Yeah.
consistent with what's been evangelized by the estate for so many years. The estate has complete rights, of course, to do whatever they want, and
Mhm.
the way I conceptually think about it is, look, everybody's family. Look, we all have stories about ourselves and our families that we're pushing forward, and they're things we want to keep in the background. Um, that's true for everybody. So that
Yeah.
the Basquiat estate, they want to do that. That's fine. It just doesn't mean that that should be what the historical record always is saying.
Yeah, yeah. Well, information is power, and they're in a position to kind of at least control that to a degree. I mean, if it's
Yeah,
not 100%.
yeah.
Um, but in your first, you talked about how passionate collectors need to be comfortable navigating a market that is not always transparent. you know? And so when an estate controls, images and narrative, you know, one could argue that they're creating, an information disadvantage for, collectors. Galleries do this as well, controlling inventory, controlling the narrative, controlling prices, absolute secrecy about the prices. You know, there's something to be said about a lack of transparency in the market. What would you say to people who are interested in maybe buying art and are very nervous about entering such an opaque ecosystem?
The first book I wrote, which came out about 10 years ago, was called Art Collecting Today. And I wrote that book because I wanted to make the rules of the game in the art world clearer. It was not a finger wagging book. It was a book to
Mhm.
sort of help people understand here's how the market operates, here's how the game is played, so they could sort of more comfortably participate in that art market. It's no different from, look, every marketplace has rules, like the fixed income market, the real estate market. Oh, every market has sort of rules and behaviors, and you want to learn, you want to understand that before you really participate actively. Uh, so I think with the art market, I think it can be an extraordinarily fun, interesting, and exciting marketplace to learn about. I mean, part of part of why people are drawn to it is because it is so interesting. And here are these artists that are making these amazing objects, and I can potentially own one. And which one should I buy? And is this artist's career going up? Is this artist's career going down? What's driving that? What are the factors? I mean, these are topics and questions that interest the hell out of most collectors. The best way to think about sort of passionate collectors, artists are their sports team. Um, um,
Mm.
and they're interested in what motivated them, how are they performing, where is their career going. And so I think if you approach it that way, it's fun and it's exciting. If on the other hand, you've got, you know, $300,000 and you decide, let me go to the Frieze Art Fair and walk through it for the first time, and buy some stuff, you're likely to be hosed.
Well, if your intention is to have a return on that investment, then you're likely
Yes,
to be hosed.
yes,
This is something I like to talk about a lot in the different, in the different platforms that I'm engaged in. But, there's different kinds of resources out there and different kinds of capital, and financial, returns are just one of them. You could really enjoy the object and just, God, spend days, weeks. You can write a book about a painting that you own. It can be
yes,
an incredibly riching sort of catalyst in your life.
yes,
And then
yes,
the other sort of major resource that you can sort of, gain from all of this are the relationships that you have with people that are like-minded, that share your interests and stuff like that.
yes.
Travel with them, go to dinner, go to I mean, it's incredibly enriching, all of these things,
Yeah.
and if you
Well,
love the objects and you build great relationships, at the end of the day, if you make money or not, I mean, maybe you don't care because you
yeah,
got such a great return out of those first 2 value drivers.
yeah, absolutely. When I talk with people who have become interested in art and want to pursue collecting, um, I actually always remind them how important it is to not buy anything quickly. Um, that better to immerse yourself in the world of art first. Start going to art fairs, go to museums, read, um, look at lots of images. Don't be an impulse buyer, so that you can develop your own tastes. You can develop some of your own ideas. And the art world, why everybody complains and moans about it being not transparent and very off putting, you know, e- every New York show, every gallery show in New York, you can walk in for free. You can talk to somebody at the front desk. If you express some modest interest in the work, you can talk to a gallery specialist, can learn about the artist. I mean, art itself, experiencing it, it's one of the least expensive and most gratifying ways, certainly for me. I mean, I am a collector. Art is available everywhere and to anyone, for peanuts. It's not that expensive to go to a museum. It's free to go to galleries. Art fairs have become a little more expensive, but so I think it's a really fun, exciting place to learn, to expose yourself to new things, and to use that as a way to develop your taste, to develop your sense of what's interesting and important to you. I think once you have some of that foundational knowledge, that's a time to start thinking about, what do I want to collect? Where do I want to pursue this? And I think when you do that, you're much more likely to have the sorts of experiences that you were talking about, where even if it's financially not the greatest investment, you've met people, you've had experiences, you've had things on your wall that create personal meaning for you and that create value. Humans have been creating great art for, like thousands and thousands of years. People will continue to create great art. The challenge is to figure out, well, what's good and why. And that's a fun sport. It's a fun activity. And I think the other thing is you can love art with ever spending significant money on it. I mean, there's so many people who are interested in art and artists and the history of art who haven't spent more than $5,000 on an artwork. And those it's sort of like music, art and music. You can become experts in them, and you can experience them without spending a lot of money, and have very rewarding and lifelong relationships with those cultural products.
Love it, Doug. Thank you so much for spending some time today. I think we're at a good point to stop. And I think what's interesting also is I think we planted some seeds for a future discussion here. So thank you for your time today.
Hey, great. Hey, thanks, Carlos. Great talking with you.